So what I'm going to talk a little bit about is just some of the lessons that I've learned from really what's been out there as best practice, and then hopefully a few examples of my own teaching and some of the tools and tips that I implemented. So for me, really the biggest message is that the best practice that is out there in the educational research literature really does work when it comes to remote instruction. What the experts are telling you to do it, definitely, 100%. So I was fortunate enough that the office at my university that deals with instructional technology and instructional design gave it a remote teaching workshop to academic staff over the summer to really help guide us into remote instruction in preparation for the fall. And for me personally, I was teaching a summer class, so it was very, very timely. And one of the biggest messages that they continue to reiterate is that in remote instruction, it really is a combination of asynchronous and synchronous meetings, that students need some synchronous time. They need to touch base with each other and with you as the professor, but that long extended lectures online or long extended recorded lectures online really leads to remote instruction fatigue very, very quickly. So it's kind of the concept of the flipped classroom that came into vogue a few years ago that some of us took on board, but many others just continued with our traditional content delivery of just lecture-based classes. But the idea is that you put as much content posted asynchronously for your students to consume at their own pace, at their own time. And then you have your synchronous sessions, or if you're in an in-person environment, your in-person class sessions be a lot shorter, a lot more focused, and a lot more active as well. And so I really did that. It took a lot of time to take all of my lectures and create them into multimedia websites that had short videos, YouTube videos, links to reading, activity prompts, all sorts of kind of a multimedia mix of delivery methods and content types. But I did it somehow, as many of you have as well. And then I really reserved the synchronous sessions. I pared them back significantly and really tried to keep them to an hour, no longer than an hour. And I really made them as active and discussion-based, or building on the asynchronous content as possible. I learned very quickly not to rehash the asynchronous content, because if students know you're going to talk about the stuff that they were supposed to read in class, then they just won't read it. So it really is essential that you make sure that the synchronous times are as active as possible and that they build on what the students were expected to do at their own time. Also, another thing that was really driven home to me from the best practice is that it's so necessary to create excessive structure for your students in the remote environment, because the remote environment by its very nature is completely structureless. So you really need to have a very predictable schedule for your students, where they know that every day of the week there is something that they need to do, whether it is a reading, whether it's an activity, whether it's an assignment, or whether it's logging into their synchronous session. And it's got to be just kind of consistently redundant in that it's always the same every single week, so the students know really what's expected of them, and they can really establish their schedule around it. Particularly for students at my institution, the vast majority of my students work. Some of them work full time. So to have that structure and predictability really helps them to integrate their schooling responsibilities around their home responsibilities and their working responsibilities. Another thing that's really important is that the online environment should not equal more assignments for your students. Over and over again, I heard from my students about how crushed they felt from this burden of work that so many of their professors had heaped on them. There was definitely a mentality at my institution that if students weren't coming to class, then they surely had more time to do assignments. And there was also a mentality that in order for a remote class to be quality, it had to be full of work. And that really doesn't work for our students. It makes online learning very overwhelming for them. And again, when they're juggling multiple responsibilities and they have to cut corners, the corners that they're going to cut are going to be their schooling responsibilities. And then finally, the other aspect of best practice that really works is making sure that you build accountability into your online material. If there aren't points or marks associated with something that you say is required, your students won't do it. So making sure that points and marks are always assigned to something, even if they're minimal, but just to emphasize that something is a required activity. And there are lots of tools available that help you build accountability. Two of the favorite ones for me personally is a tool called Hypothesis. Hypothesis is an annotation tool. If your university uses Canvas, it's a tool that's integrated into Canvas. And what it allows you to do is to download a video or a PDF or a website, and your students can go in and highlight text and then comment on it. So I was able to have some really meaningful conversations around the 2009 NAS report. I had certain segments of that report that were required for the students to read and comment upon. And the richness of the discussion was just such a pleasure to behold. And that's certainly a tool moving forward, regardless of whether I'm remote or in person, that I'm going to continue to use. It basically means that I know my students are doing the reading that I'm assigning because I can see them interacting with that reading. The other tool that I found incredibly useful is a tool called PlayPosit. Again, it's a tool that's integrated into Canvas, so that's very easy to set it up as an assignment. And PlayPosit allows you to upload an MP4 file or a YouTube video, and it allows you to insert into that video question prompts. So I found this useful in a couple of different ways. Definitely for videos that they were required to watch, it allowed me to insert questions. And so I knew they watched the video because I saw that they responded to questions. The other thing that it allowed me to do is the lecturing that I tend to do in person tends to be very interactive, where I'm throwing out questions to the students as much as I am, delivering that content through lecturing. And I really missed that give and take being in a remote environment and trying to record, even just short 5-minute kind of mini lectures. And again, PlayPosit allowed me to insert questions, the same questions that I would normally throw out to the students, in the kind of flow of a lecture. It allowed me to insert that into the video. And then again, I got the response from the students. I also knew that the students had watched the mini lecture because I could see that they had registered those responses. So those kind of accountability tools are a really great way to ensure that your students are engaging with all this asynchronous material that you painstakingly put together for them. And really, the results kind of spoke for themselves. I was really almost dumbfounded by just the positive results that I experienced just from instituting what I had been taught as best practice for remote instruction. So the first amazing thing was that my students came to every class. That never happens in, quote unquote, the real world in in-person instruction. I always have students that just kind of like come and go or disappear. And I think because the synchronous sessions were very engaging, they were very active, students got to discuss and they felt more comfortable discussing in a remote environment. They wanted to come to class. They wanted to be engaged. Now, again, the caveat to this is that my classes tend to be relatively small, anywhere between 10 students to about 25. But even in some of my slightly larger classes, over than 25, I still found that students were very engaged. It's just instead of doing a classroom discussion, we did a lot of breakout rooms where the rooms would then report back to the larger class what they had talked about. The other thing that I found astounding was that the students actually did their reading. And again, I think that was largely because I instituted tools like Hypothesis that really tracked the students engaging with that reading. I was also incredibly pleasantly surprised to see that students were turning in their assignments. Again, in kind of traditional content delivery, I would always have some students that just wouldn't turn something in. And for whatever reason, they were willing to take that 0. Probably it was a bit of a cost-benefit analysis in terms of all the other work that they had to do. But I think because I instituted very predictable weekly assignments that were much smaller in nature, in some cases, the assignment was really about the process, not so much the product. So I gave them points or marks because they just did it, not necessarily the quality of what they did, but it was really the effort that I wanted to see more than anything else. And so therefore, students were turning in all their assignments. And then ultimately, at the end of the semester, my students performed better than they did under traditional delivery methods. They got more A's. And again, I think it's because the remote environment was structured in a way that really helps support student success, as opposed to just, heaping the work on them or making kind of value-based judgments on their quality of being a student. There was a lot more flexibility into the way the students were marked. So just a couple examples from my 3 classes that I taught this past term. So one class is called Forensic Science Theory and Policy. It really talks around the profession of forensic science. So all about professional ethics, cognitive bias, standards of best practice in forensic science. And for many, many years, I had tried to collaborate with our law school because I'm sure many of you have experienced our legal professionals could really use a little forensic education sometimes in terms of more effectively questioning forensic evidence in court. And law schools are very difficult to work with. They're very siloed in a lot of ways. They have very specific structures of how their classes and how their grading runs. And I'd really struggled over the years to collaborate with them. But finally this year, and I think in some ways the remote environment helped with this, we were able to team teach this class between myself and a law professor. So we had 26 forensic students, mostly graduate students, and 13 law students. So there was essentially a 2-to-1 ratio. And what really helped with this class is we always had a mock trial, but this year, because we had law students, instead of myself acting as the lawyer, we could have the law students work with the forensic students, questioning them in a mock trial environment. And this was just mutually beneficial in so many different ways. It gave the forensic students a much more realistic version of a mock trial, and it gave the law students the experience of questioning a scientific report, because they just aren't trained to do that in law school. Many of them will never interact with an expert report until they are actually, working in the professional world. So it was just a really great experience. Some of the things that didn't go well, usually in the mock trial, we only deal with prosecution experts, but because of the structure with the law students, we had both prosecution and defense reports that were being written, and there was a lot of confusion as to how to write those defense reports. So certainly going forward, I think I would be creating a lot more examples to help the students, help guide them with writing their reports. And another actually interesting survey response that I got from my students is my students wanted more quizzes, believe it or not. They actually wanted a weekly quiz after the asynchronous material to ensure that they had the incentive to really dive deep into that asynchronous material, but also to test themselves to make sure that they really comprehended what were the main takeaways from that weekly session. So those are definitely some things I would do differently. More of a lab-based course that I taught this term is forensic pattern evidence. So these are all the feature-based comparison fields of forensic science. And, like all of us, we couldn't have our traditional laboratory practical type sessions. So something that I did for this particular class is I had to redo essentially all of my practical sessions, all of my lab SOPs. And I created a lab in a closet or a lab in a box, depending on my students. Some students were completely remote. They were actually in different parts of the United States. So because these types of forensic science don't really take a lot of nasty chemicals, I could just put things in the post and send to my students. So for the students that were fully remote that could never come to campus, I put together a box of supplies. And again, it was only 2 students that I had to do this for, so it wasn't very onerous. And I certainly had plenty of supplies to go around. And I posted them to the students with their laboratory manual. For the students that were able to come to campus, I found a very small lab, essentially like a closet-sized, cupboard-sized lab that had a fume hood and a bench and really could only fit 1 person. And I designated that the laboratory classroom for this class. So each week I set out the materials and I set out the SOP, and then students signed up for a slot in the closet where they could do their laboratory practical on their own. And again, there were no real chemicals that were being used for this, so they were perfectly fine doing their laboratory exercise on their own. We did have 1 lab practical that did use chemicals. And for that particular practical, we had to basically run it 3 times with small groups. And for the students that were fully remote, that's what the image is that you have here. I have one of my students paired up with a fully remote student that's here on this iPad. And so the 2 of them are working through the lab together and working through the SOP together. And the person who's in the lab is able to broadcast the reactions that are taking place, the color change that's taking place to the student that's fully remote. So they're getting as close to a laboratory simulation as possible. Also, I used Google Drive like never before. So particularly with things like fingerprints, I would have my students take their 10-print form and upload it to Google Drive. And then I would have them upload a single latent print of that they laid and dusted and lifted themselves. And then I was able to assign a latent to a student, and the student would use Google Drive and use the records in Google Drive to try to identify which student that latent print belonged to. And I did this for lots of different things, for firearms comparison, for hairs and fibers, where I would take pictures down the microscope and then have questioned evidence, and they would use the resources on Google Drive to make their identifications. Also, I did a virtual lab group for the first time, or lab notebook, sorry, my apologies. Normally they would do actual physical notebooks, but this year we did lab notebooks, again, using Google Drive, and that worked relatively well. The takeaway from this course is that it was so much work, but it was necessary in order to give the students the fullest experience possible, particularly with this particular field of forensic science. What I would do differently is I would give them more structure. I really left them to do their lab practicals on their own time. And I found that towards the end of the term, they had gotten themselves backed up and they weren't keeping up with it week on week. And suddenly they had multiple practicals that they had to rush through in order to get their lab notebooks submitted by the end of the term. So in the future, I would actually set them a deadline for every single practical so that way they were turning them in a structured and more repeatable kind of way. So that way they didn't get themselves backlogged. And then finally, my last class that I ran this semester remotely is called Forensic Science Symposium. It's essentially a welcome to graduate school course or module, and it's all about providing them with the graduate student and professional skills that they're going to need to be successful. Really what didn't work, I didn't make many changes to this class. I essentially just moved this class online. I did create asynchronous material, but I didn't put in quite the same level of effort as perhaps my other two classes. What really didn't work with this class being remote was the community building. One of the whole goals of Forensic Science Symposium is for an incoming cohort to get to know each other and to build bonds and to form friendships. And that was really difficult to do in a remote environment. You know, this class normally happens at night, so we're always sitting down and kind of having our tea together before we launch into the content for the week. And again, it just didn't quite work over Zoom. Something that did work actually really, really well, better than I had expected, is at the end of the term, we have a networking event. And the aim of the networking event is twofold. First of all, it's to simulate a conference environment where you have to network, you have to get to know people. You're in kind of a reception sort of atmosphere with food and drink, and you strike up conversations with people. So it's to give them practice at doing that. The other goal of the networking event is the students at this point are starting to think about what sort of research projects they're going to write in the coming term, and what faculty members, what academic staff are going to help advise and supervise those projects. So it's an opportunity to introduce them to the other members of academic staff, to the other faculty members, and get them talking about that person's research. So what we did this year, because it was remote, is we did something that I like to call speed dating for scientists. So I had 9 new students, and so I found 9 faculty members that were willing to attend this event, and I put them one-on-one into breakout rooms. So 1 faculty member, 1 student, and they had, I think I set the timer for 8 minutes. They had 8 minutes to talk to each other, and the faculty members were not to prepare anything. They were literally just to turn up to this event. The students, on the other hand, were expected to strike up the conversation and to get the faculty members to talk about their research. And it went really well. The 8 minutes were up. They would automatically, we did this on Zoom, so they would be spat back into the Zoom main meeting room. I would reshuffle the breakout rooms, and away they would go for another 8 minutes. It really was fantastic. Most of the students could have carried on talking with the faculty for more than 8 minutes. It definitely created some relationships that hopefully will continue to play out over the semester. And the faculty members came from a range of different departments. They were not all forensic science faculty members. Some of them were in things like public administration or the English department even. But they all had research that in one way or another had connections to forensic science. And a lot of the faculty members from outside of the department said they love the event. They would like to institute something similar in their department. So I definitely highly recommend that as an activity to do with your students. Something that I would do differently in this class to create that community would be to do more breakout rooms so that students had time to talk to each other in small groups of even just 2 people or 3 people. So that is all I have for you in this short period of time. And let me stop sharing my screen. And I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Kimberlee, for that excellent presentation. And you may be able to see yourself that there's several people dropping comments in the chat box, talking very positively about the ideas that you've had. There have also been a couple of apologies because the meeting was scheduled to end at 3, so a few people have had to leave us. But we've got a couple of questions. The first one has been quite a bit of interest in your magic box that you send out to the students who can't make it to the lab, about the kind of things that are in that box and the kind of activities that you ask them to undertake.
Sure, yeah. So again, it's a pattern evidence class. So it's things like fingerprints, footwear, tire marks. So I send them you can get single-use pots of fingerprint powder and single-use fingerprint brushes. So I sent those students a polyester with a Zephyr brush and black powder. I also sent magnetic powder and a magnetic wand. I sent a linen tester. I sent calipers. And I also had a list of things that they needed to purchase themselves. We have the most wonderful thing that the United States has ever invented is the dollar store. It is amazing what you can buy for $1. The pound store just isn't quite the same. But yeah, you can get a hammer at the dollar store. You can get, one of the things that I love to do with my students is have them look at the patterns that glass makes when you break it. So you can track bullet holes in a glass, for instance. And so you can get yourself from a dollar store just a $1 picture frame, and there are instructions for how you can basically, hit it with a hammer and create those fracture patterns to view. So it was things like that. It was a combination of some things that I needed to post to them, like calipers, for instance. They were unlikely to have those at home, and things that they could find around the house or that they could purchase at their local dollar store, and then just tailoring those SOPs for those sorts of activities that they were doing. So I'm happy to share all of that. If people want to email me, I will just send you the entire lab manual. I'm very happy to do that.
Great, thank you so much. We have pound stores over here as well, so that's good news. Hannah, I can see you'd like to ask a question by turning on your microphone. If you'd like to do that now, that's fine with us.
Oh, sure. Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yeah. Hi, Hannah.
Hi. Wow, that you've done a lot of work to make your students really fully immersed. It's amazing. I was wondering how people felt between the in-person lab work versus that virtual lab work when they're paired up with a remote student. Did they feel as if the work was uneven, or how about connectivity issues as well?
Yeah, well, we were fine with connectivity issues, fortunately. That has been kind of a real blessing throughout the semester, is we never really had any disasters with internet access or anything like that. And yeah, so much of this is so dependent on the internet. Actually, the one person in lab, the one person remote, I didn't get a sense of any like inequities in working, because they were just so excited to talk to each other. So they really had such a good time doing the lab together because they had some one-on-one contact with another human being.
Oh, we all need that now.
Yeah. And
it's so nice to talk to you.
Particularly for those students. So one student that comes to mind, we're based in New Jersey. This student was in Texas and really felt throughout the semester that he was missing out on the times that the students could get together in person. So when he was paired with a fellow student for that one in-person lab, they just had the best time interacting with each other. It was really a delight to see. So, I think if this were to persist kind of for a longer period of time, that would definitely be an issue that needs to be addressed. Maybe there could be, the person who's doing the work in lab takes the notes and the person who's fully remote writes it up into the final report, or some way to balance the work. But certainly this first time around, they were just so happy to talk to each other.
That's great. Thanks.
Thank you. And the final question that I can see is from Suzanne. She was really interested in when you're talking about the dating and the quiz in the last slide. She just asked for an example of the type of questions that you asked in your quiz.
So what sort? I'm trying to think of what quiz that was in relationship to. So in terms of the speed dating, we didn't ask any quiz. We didn't have any quiz questions for the speed dating. It was really just the students were told that they needed to strike up conversation with the faculty member about their research. And again, just beautiful kind of conversations flowed from that. Many times when the timer went off, I kind of half caught people in mid-sentence and everyone expressed disappointment that their time had come to an end. But again, the point of it was to encourage them to then reconnect with the faculty outside of the class. In terms of quiz questions, so after reading, for instance, or after a synchronous session, just having, say, like a multiple choice 5-question quiz on some of the key terms that were in that asynchronous session, or some of the key concepts that were really important for the students to pick up. I did find that with my exams, I made my exams open notes so the students could go back to any of the asynchronous material for their exam questions. And I did see that there was a struggle. So the takeaway I had from that was that students were kind of glossing over the asynchronous material instead of really digesting it. And I think if I had instituted more regular kind of weekly quizzes, that there might be, they might have dived a little deeper into that asynchronous material. So that's something I will do moving forward.
Thank you. And we just had one final question that I missed. It's from Catherine, and she was just asking, do you have any general tips for improving student engagement with asynchronous / synchronous activities?
So certainly with the synchronous activities, most of our sessions were largely discussion based, and the students really loved it. I've always struggled getting students to talk in class, but they didn't have any problems talking in the remote environment. And probably part of that is because they can have their cameras off, so they feel less exposed, less like people are looking at them. So two of probably the main tool that I used for discussion, the one that worked the best, is we would have a question prompt based on the reading, based on the asynchronous material, and we would break the class up into breakout rooms of 3 students. And those 3 students had, say, 7 minutes to discuss whatever that question prompt is. Prior to assigning those breakout rooms, each group would be given a spokesperson. So that spokesperson's job was to report back as to what happened in their discussion. So that meant that you could assign the students that don't normally say a whole lot to be the spokesperson, and that got them a little more active in class. And it also meant that students were more comfortable talking amongst themselves in smaller groups as opposed to being in a big group of, say, 30 students. So we found that, again, similar to the speed dating, we had really rich small group discussions, and when the time was up, the students were still actively talking about whatever it was, and then that spilled over into the larger group. Another tool that I've used really successfully, both in person and remotely, is something called the fishbowl. And the fishbowl is kind of a similar small group discussion technique. So you have a question prompt and you assign 4 students to talk amongst themselves. The rest of the class just listens into that discussion and just takes notes or whatever, just soaks it in. So it's really and that's why it's called a fishbowl, is because those 4 students are essentially in a fishbowl. The rest of us are kind of circled around them, listening to their conversation. If you're doing this physically in person, you actually move those 4 desks together so that the 4 people are actually sat together and looking at each other and not looking at the rest of us staring at them. And you give them about 5 or 10 minutes, depending on the discussion, to talk amongst themselves. After that time is up, you then open the discussion to the larger group. And it really works very well. The larger group then engages, they then kind of expand that discussion beyond. And it really means that the professor is much more of a facilitator and an observer. Really, the students are the ones that are kind of running the show. It's worked very well.
Thank you so much. Some great ideas. I love the fishbowl technique personally. I think that's the end of the questions now, and I'm conscious we're a little over time. So I'm just going to say thank you so much for giving up your time to speak to us and for the excellent talk.